that's in a. Okay, great. Well, all right. So just to cover kind of some of the issues and that have transpired in recent years. So, for instance, a typical kind of AI ethics issues related to the Apple Card being investigated for giving 10, 20 times higher the credit limit to the husband of the couple versus the wife of the couple with similar income levels, similar credit score, similar everything. So while they never use gender specifically in their algorithm, somehow because of the data they used, that came true. So that's kind of one of the examples of, and this is obviously related to bias. Another bias-related example is around Amazon kind of had to completely ditch a recruitment system they were building that had machine learning at its core because it was just never picking any women, right, for the role, which was quite unfortunate. I mean, like lower rates is, manageable, but like no women whatsoever is quite bad. And it's because of the data they were using to train the system was really not fit for purpose. But this is this is one type of issues, and you can see how this type of issue kind of bring harm to the end consumer, the end user of whatever product uses the AI system that's brought to life. Now, different kind of problem, which many people don't realize that it's necessarily part of the same sphere of problems, is just general robustness of the system. Like if this is, a second dimension, but very important as well. So it's not just, if the system is not performing well, it's not just harm to the consumer that can happen, but it's also the business itself can go through a terrible predicament. So the example here is for a technical issue called drift, which basically because of it, Zillow has, which is a property company, a prop tech company, they lost about a quarter of the value of their company because they kind of picked up on this issue with one of their algorithms a little bit too late. Like they just left it too late. Now, no human lives were lost in the process, but a lot of people were unfortunately laid off and a lot of money were lost. Now, people wouldn't associate this with AI ethics, but the reality is that is the other side of the coin, in a sense. If the systems are not robust, and they're not only going to be harmful and unfair to the consumer, but they're going to be problematic for the business itself. And just to give you an example of how the same technical issues cause different outcomes for different stakeholder groups, but similar kind of mechanic of play. Imagine if the use case you're having is actually around diagnosing some sort of healthcare condition. The example here from the US is that some of the hospitals using predictive modeling to assess whether a customer will return for like a high-risk condition in the hospital, so we'll kind of have another episode of a heart attack or whatever it is. So those predictive models were unfortunately found to be really poor predictors for entire swathes of the population, in this case, Black people. So that is a very problematic thing. It means not only are you discriminating against someone, but like your model is just not working for like a whole entire demographic group, right? A lot of people. So this is the kind of things that AI ethics and AI safety is really bringing to the fore, right? Beyond the hype around AI safety and kind of killer robots, these are like real life situations that can happen, and unfortunately, the same issues that plague these kind of models can also plague your use case as well. Right. So moving on, it's okay. While these have been in the news for a while, to be honest, it has only been with the emergence of the large language models that now people are just much more aware there's a higher public awareness of the issues, because with large language models, the end user can actually tell when there's a problem. Whereas before, if you were denied a mortgage and it had something to do with the postcode or with your, let's say, demographics in the States, for instance, it would be very hard for you to prove that case and to even know to begin with that that's why you were denied a mortgage. Whereas if you see an answer from ChatGPT that's obviously irrational and strange, then that's very clear to the user how it's wrong. So I think for the first time this year and kind of at the back end of last year, we're seeing a true uplift in AI ethics. And coincidentally, I think that also is happening on kind of years of building up to the regulation. So what Stylianos was saying, and this is not where we get into things like, okay, we've talked about the things that could go wrong with your system. And now it's kind of, that from the point of view, if you're running a business, if you're like C-level, or if you're kind of responsible for the system, you need to make sure that those things do not wrong. But at the same time, we are starting to see like a standards and a regulatory component coming into play. Right. So what is that standard? So just some kind of things to be aware of, basically. So in the main one that is a lot of it's been approved and kind of went through a lot of the processes, and then by the end of the year, the very firm understanding is that it will pass. The legislation will pass is the EU AI Act. And for those of you familiar with the GDPR, and I guess for most people who have some sort of connection with data, GDPR is a very known legislation. This is kind of wants to be the equivalent of GDPR for AI systems, and the kind of high level points is that it divides systems into different kind of risk levels based on the impact to the end consumer, and based on the risk level, there's different processes, different ways to kind of ensure that the system is behaving appropriately according to the regulation. In the UK, it's much more, much less definitive, shall we say. The UK at the moment their stance is that basically there's already existing legislation on discrimination and so forth, like GDPR, for instance, that a lot of the issues with AI systems, where a lot of the issues with AI systems are captured. So they're probably going to move more towards the standards. In the US, if your business is at all based there or dealing with the customers there, the legislation is very piecemeal, but it's very state driven. So you have some states like New York where they have specific AI recruitment legislation that's been approved, and so you have to have a bias on it, basically, if you are doing some sort of AI-based recruitment in New York. California has privacy, like very strict privacy and biometrics setups and so forth. So that's in a nutshell. Now, apart from the regulation itself, what you might want to be aware of, and again, just putting that that persona, that cap on of someone who's kind of responsible for the system in an organization. You might be familiar with the ISO standards, maybe IEEE standards for the data side. Now, these are starting to emerge for AI systems. So if you're a provider or a vendor to a different organization, I think the idea is that they will start being required, but obviously that will take a long time. But the standards are actually appearing. In healthcare, everyone expects the process to be much faster. So that if that's your sector, then the standards are already there and they'll have to be upheld. Great. So normally at this stage I would kind of ask some questions, but to keep it interactive. But in this case, we'll just keep going. and with two more things. So the frameworks, there are a myriad of frameworks at the moment. You know, like these are some examples. This is a vendor framework, TRISM. Then we have the Responsible AI Singaporean framework, which is, you know, which it's a very thorough piece of work, shall we say. But primarily, these are the key things these are the key themes of what needs to be considered, right? So a system, and there's nothing kind of, shall we say, surprising about this, but it's worth mentioning and worth keeping in mind. There's an element of transparency, which is actually very hard with anything that's beyond the logistic regression, like with any deep learning kind of system. And what exactly transparency means and so forth, it's tricky. Explainability, again, same issue, and a level of human oversight. So there has to be some sort of human in the loop, and based on how risky the use case is, you know, there has to be more or less of that. Fairness and inclusion. So we've talked about that quite a bit in the examples. Now, data governance and privacy has a bit of a overlap with GDPR. I don't think anyone is clear kind of where one ends and one finishes, but with LLMs especially, this is becoming like a key topic for people of concern. Then we have, you know, the robustness element is something I would say kind of goes without saying. If you are building the system, you want it to be as good as possible. Otherwise, what is the point of building in the first place? But it does come with some added principles around, you know, the traceability of the system, and like, you know, logging and storing and repeatability and all of that. So yeah, that's in a nutshell. And I guess a last one, safety and security. So safety is a bit of a tricky topic, so I'm not going to get into it with a lot of opinions on it. But security, but this general area encompasses kind of, shall we say, defense against intentionally bad actors. That, you know, especially with foundational models, you might have a individual, you know, like with similar to cybersecurity, they would try to influence the model's output in a way by injecting certain prompts or certain data in the system, right? So that's something that is kind of a shall we say, a newer problem brought forth by these foundation models rather than kind of the more traditional use cases that we've talked about initially. Okay, so and of course we can discuss any of this more in the actual Q&A, but to just kind of try to bring it more to life. So let's say you're building, so this is maybe not as simple as it, but let's say you're building some sort of large language model based application for the health sector. So your application is not diagnosing anyone. That would be quite tricky. But maybe it's just summarizing doctors' notes. Let's say you're some sort of digital healthcare provider is just summarizing doctors' notes into some sort of summaries that are more easily accessible, or they're in some sort of format that you want them to be. Now, you know, people, for instance, you're deciding after some due diligence that, you know, a large language model where it can be API driven, self-hosted, whatever is the way to go. Maybe you don't want to use something more traditional. Now, you know, there will be some issues that will come with that by default, right? So, like, spoiler alert. I think this is not, you know, terribly surprising. Like I said, the awareness on these issues is much higher than it was before, but you will have sometimes, unfortunately, the summaries might pick up, depending on how you set up your system and what are your mitigation layers. But if you don't do much work on that, then the system will output things that are inaccurate. even though, it shouldn't. There isn't that much distance between doctor's notes and the summary, but it will. You might have some privacy issues based on which supplier you decide to use. So again, that's a consideration. I think privacy is the one which is very clear to builders in the space, but unfortunately, it's kind of the one that's easiest to solve, really. And we're expecting big suppliers to open up a lot more and to solve this problem for kind of AI builders. Now, the third one, bias, is going to be much harder to address for this use case. The way bias will kind of rear its head will be by defaulting, in some cases, to stereotypes when using pronouns, when kind of inferring which subject or which condition the subject has. So unfortunately, yeah, the large language model will do a lot of that because of the way it's built. And while the providers are trying to put mitigations in place, it's not the fastest process. And the fourth one will be toxicity. So there, on this use case, I'd expect the proportion to be quite low, but there might be instances of prompts that will yield kind of insults and toxic answers to users. So yeah, so these are, okay, it's not easy, especially for a large language model. It's not easy to build them robustly. But I guess if we take kind of one issue, there's two different ways to approach the solution, or they're actually the same way, but two different aspects of approaching the solution. And fundamentally, like, there's no guarantees, in the end, right? So that's kind of what people need to realize. It is an odds-based process, but at least from a standards point of view, a regulation point of view, and the point of view of your own kind of internal testing and monitoring, you want to do the best job possible, right? So the first way to approach it is from a process standpoint. And the process, this is like an example for a use case that has some sort of bias component, right? So you need to, some use cases might not, like supply chain, maybe not, you might not have it, but in this case you would. And what this kind of shows clearly that from the start of the process, from the start of the actual build and conceptualizing the system, you're going to have to consider, okay, what kind of bias might I have? And there's a lot of publications kind of helping out with that, and it's starting to be a little bit more determined, though it's a work in progress, but it's starting to be a little bit more determined. Then you're starting to consider, for bias, this is especially important, what kind of stakeholder groups I might have. Then you're looking into the data going in the system, and I would say not just the data, but specific step-by-step issues. And in the technical part, we can expand on that, but the general, let's say, technical element. And then there's obviously a risk impact and assessment, like in any other project governance thing. And then all together, this should hopefully be able to lead you to a system evaluation. Now, obviously, because AI systems are very iterative, and let's say you develop the system, then you put in production, maybe it picks up, it learns a little bit on the way, so there's a lot of movement there. So the key is for this process to be kind of how should I put it, covering the end-to-end cycle, right? So from a process point of view, if you have most of these things, if ideally all, then some of the standards, you'd be able to meet some of the standards already, right? So that's a good news, right? So it doesn't mean your system will be perfect. It just means you are trying your hardest to make sure that it's not discriminatory. Now, from a technical point of view, this is where, and this slide might not be the most relevant, but this is where the problem, like in the case of bias, the problem is actually probably one of the hardest, but in the case of privacy, actually, it's much more easy technically. So from a technical point of view, what your focus is to like, okay, figure out, just looking at the technical element of the system. So maybe you have a pipeline you've developed, and the pipeline you've put in production. Just figure out at each step what are some of the issues that might appear that will lead to bias. For instance, data collection. Maybe you're not collecting data from a good representation of your population. So you might have like great data on some demographics and terrible data on others. Then when it comes to like maybe feature creation, maybe some of the features that go into your model are obviously proxies for a demographic. Now, depending on the use case, you might want to leave them in, but in the case of like a credit risk model or any kind of recruitment related thing, or anywhere where you make a judgment on the consumer, that's not a good idea. You gotta clean that stuff. Your sampling, your model itself, and then once all of this goes into production, then all these checks have to be kind of repeated and make sure that if there is a step that has an issue, you capture that, and then you find ways to mitigate it. And these are quite the problems mentioned on the slide, in the sense they are quite easy problems. They're fixable. With large language models, it's a lot more complex because it depends on how your system interacts with, let's say, an API coming from OpenAI or wherever. But there are ways for you to deal with it, whether it's like a guardrail, whether you like look at fine tuning, whether you just use the LLM for kind of some sort of text manipulation, but maybe don't use it for the final output, right? So there are ways around it in terms of mitigation. And once you find a problem, then it's a kind of like you fix a bug in a more, shall we say, traditional software system. So yeah, I mean, obviously, I feel like I've talked for quite a while, but it would be great. Maybe I'll just do a quick recap. But just from, I guess, your point of view, like, these are the issues that could happen, and it's not just about the ethical or fairness component. It's also about the robustness of the system itself. Like, have a bad system, your bottom line and so forth will be impacted. We do see a lot more regulation now, so need to be aware of this, and probably by next year, when it's going to come into effect in the EU, a lot of businesses in the UK will be impacted. You have some frameworks, but primarily they're all saying very similar things. So don't worry too much. But it's good to know. Just kind of pick one, and it's good to know that they're similar across. And then in terms of actually tackling a use case, once you start understanding, okay, which dimensions of these principles can be problematic in my use case, then you can start going, okay, tackle it from a process point of view, and also tackle it from a technical point of view. So yeah, that's in a nutshell. I can maybe stop sharing now, and then we can look at questions and so forth.
Yeah, I think there are some questions. Thank you for the very interesting presentation, Raluca. I think Chris is asking about the differences between explainability, transparency, and traceability.
Yeah. So transparency is a lot more about the whole process. So for instance, it might include like how your data collection is happening, or just like all these steps and so forth. Explainability is a lot more about specific model outputs. Are they explainable? So if that's where the problem kind of stems from. If I'm using some sort of deep learning approach, it is very hard to explain exactly what drives the outcome, so the actual decision. So there's like an active field of research dealing with that, basically. And what was the last one? Sorry, Stylianos, what was the last one?
Explainability, transparency, and traceability.
Yeah, traceability. So traceability, I would say, is more about the actual process of logging the thing. So I feel like there is an overlap with transparency, but transparency, I would say, includes information a lot more about the, shall we say, the people involved and like who this information gets to, whereas the traceability is more about actual logging and you know, being able to repeat what you've done and all of that. You know, it's I mean, it's not the clearest of differences, I would say. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And then Nikos has a question: how would you advise firms overcome information confidentiality / privacy issues?
Sorry, I'm not quite following that.
Yeah, it's the last question. How do you advise firms overcome, I think, confidentiality and privacy issues?
Yeah, so that maybe, is there a use case you have in mind, Nikos? Because that might help a little bit. Otherwise, it's kind of a very broad and not super useful answer.
Hi, thank you. Very, very interesting presentation. It's just well, the question came when you were showing sort of, you know, a framework for responsible AI, and you mentioned that one of the issues that firms could be facing is confidentiality of information, particularly using generative AI. So you know, if I'm a firm and I'm worried about sort of, you know, my employees passing in confidential information to sort of an open AI algorithm, I mean, what can I do about it? Is there anything I can do about it? So any thoughts would be very welcome.
Okay, sure. That makes sense. So there's two kind of things, two ways to kind of go around it. First, well, Microsoft / OpenAI is kind of in the process of opening up the service to some sectors where basically they can kind of guarantee data protection like you would on a cloud, right? So you would on Azure, right? So if once they actually, but you know, it's unclear like for whom this is open, and they have some rate limits, and it's tricky, right? So it's not super clear yet, but I think the expectation is that they will open up a service like this for businesses, where they stop the data from getting to OpenAI itself, and I don't know what's the agreement between the two of them, but I'm guessing they host the actual API. The second element is that there are a lot of open source large language models now, so self-hosting would definitely be an answer now, a kind of logical conclusion, because self-hosting is expensive and it requires kind of specialized knowledge, right? So a logical way to maybe do it is to have some, like a few like services where it's basically self-hosted, but it's available to multiple companies, right? Now, you know, it's based on the builder's appetite to actually engage with the large language models and, you know, operationalize it. And another option is around, depending on the use case. So you might not want to actually use someone else's large language models, but build your own. Obviously, if that's the case, it might be slightly more manageable from a technical point of view, like from a computation point of view. But because your use case maybe just uses internal computing information or whatever, the performance wouldn't be too impacted. So that's a kind of 2B if you want. Yeah.
Excellent. So are there any other questions? All right, cool. So I think we finished pretty much in time. So thanks everyone for joining us today. Again, if you're interested in the Lean AI ethics framework, just make sure to shoot me over an email. We'll be more than happy to hear from you. Also more than happy to hear about any ideas or suggestions for events that you might have. AI is taking off, so we're always open to suggestions about different topics to cover. And yeah, we hope to see you again soon. Thanks, everyone. Have a good rest of the week.
Thank you.